Greg, welcome to studio.
Thank you.
You've just come back from a whirlwind tour of Central America, Mexico being one of the destinations. Why the decision to go to Mexico?
I think Mexico is extremely interesting. It's a country that has revolutionized its manufacturing industry over the last 20, 25 years. And despite periodic economic crises, it's actually transformed itself, particularly in terms of diversification and the creation of over 2 million jobs in the manufacturing sector. And I think with South Africa facing the jobs crisis that it has, and with commodities facing an uncertain downturn future, I think it's interesting to look at manufacturing. And of course, Mexico has also had this very strong commodity sector, but it's been able to employ that increasingly to its manufacturing advantage. So it was really a case of looking at what the Mexicans have done, how they've managed the security difficulties, and whether there were any experiences that could be shared usefully with Africa.
You rightly point out that they've still got some of the social dynamics that we experience: unemployment, drugs, low levels of education. But despite that, they've been able to move up the value chain in manufacturing.
I think the big lesson from Mexico is they haven't had an industrialization strategy. What they've had is they've had a trade strategy, and that has driven industrialization. They've basically said, we're right next door to a giant market, the United States, the biggest economy in the world. We want a slice of this action. And the way in which they did that was, of course, through NAFTA and through duty-free exports into the US market. And that transformed the manufacturing sector, initially through low value added in terms of labor costs, producing apparel, for example, and the so-called maquiladoras, the so-called border industries. But very quickly, over the last 20 years, has transformed into much higher value addition industries, particularly in the auto sector. They're now ranking sixth largest automobile producer in the world, and of course, primarily for the American market. And the image of the sort of low skill, low wage Mexican worker is quite at odds with the reality, which is much higher skill, much higher wages, and increasingly into things like nanotechnology, incubation centers, the relationship with government through these different initiatives. But the big thing is this is driven by trade, by openness. This is an open economy of the United States. And now, as a final point to this, they're now leveraging their natural gas advantage, their fuel advantage, their petroleum advantage in terms of low energy, getting low cost energy into these marketplaces and being able to go into the next stage of industrialization, but again, principally for the US market. The big takeaway from this is, on a per capita basis, Mexico exports more in the way of manufactured goods than China does today.
If we compare the auto industry, we're ranked 24th, and you mentioned that they're 7th. What do we need to do in our sector?
I think we need to attract some of the big players. And to do that, of course, you've got to ask them what they want, the conditions that they want. Obviously, we don't have the same geographic advantage that the Mexicans do in terms of being positioned right next door to a big market. But if you take Africa as a whole, we have a giant market on our doorstep. We need to integrate ourselves better to be able to take maximum use of that and learn from the Mexicans in this regard. Labor is increasingly the value addition aspect here. It's about attracting big investors, big plants, getting them into the African market space and asking the conditions that they require to be able to do so.
Mexico's also had political change. How much of that has influenced being able to move up the value chain?
Well, one of the points, of course, about getting the auto sector in is that they've had incredible labour stability. I mean, when we ask people when they last had a strike in the auto sector, no one could remember. I mean, literally could not remember. And that doesn't compare very favourably with South Africa. But you're right, too, in the macro political sense, there has been a great deal of change. Of course, the institutionalized Revolutionary Party of Mexico, an extraordinary title, was in power for 70 years and ultimately sort of collapsed under its own internal contradictions and decay. And the role of the opposition movements in pushing through reform and in making politics more competitive by being a real alternative is a key part of the Mexican transformation story this century. Of course, that change occurred with Vicente Fox coming in 2000, followed by Calderon, and they certainly changed the rules of the road. And I think the PRI now back in power today, and it shows there is life after power, they are generally regarded as being much more competitive. And in fact, they have now ushered in a whole new raft of reforms around education, around the relationship between the unions, particularly in the teaching vocation, something that we need to learn from in South Africa, sort of breaking the stranglehold that the unions have on this market. They've been able to push through these reforms, including in energy, which in fact the opposition was unable to do during their time in government. So political change and political competitiveness are a big part of the economic competitiveness story.
I couldn't help but see the similarities going through your research paper. But one thing that came to mind is, do we as South Africa move directly to high value manufacturing, or do we start on the lower side, lower value goods?
Well, I think we do all of those things. I mean, I think we do services better than we're doing it at the moment. It's clearly a big chunk of the South African economy, more than 50% of our economy. We do mining better. They're doing natural resources better. We do that better. It's perhaps a declining industry, and certainly in the current downturn would be regarded as a declining industry. But we need to put in place the conditions that will attract investors into that market. And they've realized more private sector engagement is what they need. And we need to do manufacturing at every level. But where we, I think, particularly in South Africa, need to do manufacturing better is we talk a lot about, you know, the right conditions, the regulatory frameworks, but actually it's the regulatory burden on small and medium-sized enterprises, the big employers and potential employers in South Africa, is very onerous, and we have to find ways to remedy that. And we'll get people producing furniture and making apparel, but we'll also get high-tech pharmaceuticals in South Africa, nanotechnology and the like. And we've got to cater for all those rungs of that ladder in between as well.
We've heard a lot about the BRICS and other emerging markets, but why have we not heard the Mexican story?
Maybe it's because it's, you know, slightly politically unpalatable, because they've really built themselves on access to the US market, and we seem to have some political problems with that. Maybe it's because they're not a member of the BRICS. Interestingly enough, when we asked Mexicans about, you know, did they find this a disadvantage, they said, well, they didn't really have very much in common with the other members of the BRICS. Brazil was largely seen as a closed economy. They're open. Russia was a commodity-dependent economy, which they're increasingly not. India was overly bureaucratic and faced all sorts of infrastructure challenges, which they increasingly don't. And China they saw as a competitor. So there was no reason to be part of this BRICS makeup. South Africa never, it's sad to say, featured much in the BRICS discussion. But they don't see a real advantage. They have NAFTA. They now have the Pacific Trade Partnership as the next stage to this wider trade agreement. They see trade as being the driver of their economy. And I think that's different from the approach taken by the other BRIC nations in terms of where they're positioning themselves.
Interesting insights. Dr. Greg Mills, thanks for your time.
Thank you.